Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The Tuesday started like any other Tuesday. Really gray sky outside, threatening rain, the smell of coffee brewing, the low hum of the refrigerator. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through the mail, mostly junk, a few bills. Honestly, at 53, my days had settled into a rhythm that was comfortable, predictable, maybe even a little dull, if I'm being truthful. My kids are grown and flown. Bless their hearts, and it's just me and Rufus, my old golden retriever, rattling around in this house that suddenly feels too big sometimes. Then I saw it. Tucked between a credit card offer and a flyer for lawn care was a proper envelope, cream-colored, heavy paper, my name and address written in actual handwriting. Not printed, not typed, written with a pen, in blue ink. That alone was enough to make me pause. People just don't send letters like that anymore. Do they? The return address wasn't familiar. Just a name, Mark Ashton, and an address in Oregon. Oregon? I didn't think I knew anyone in Oregon. I turned the envelope over and over in my hands, the weight of it feeling strangely significant. Mark Ashton. The name tickled something in the back of my mind, a vague echo from long ago. I set the bills aside. My curiosity piqued. Rufus patted over and nudged my hand, probably wondering why the routine had been interrupted. I gave his head a scratch, my eyes still fixed on the envelope. Maybe it was a mistake, sent to the wrong address. But no, it was clearly for me, Sarah Miller. I traced the elegant loops of the handwriting. Definitely a man's script, confident and neat. Mark Ashton, Mark, wait a minute. My cousin Jane. Didn't she have a friend named Mark back in college? A quiet guy, artistic type, if I remembered correctly. We'd all hung out a few times during summer breaks, maybe 25, 30 years ago. It seemed unlikely. Why would he be writing to me after all this time? We barely knew each other. Maybe Jane had given him my address for some reason, but she would have mentioned it. Surely. We talk every week. A little knot of unease tightened in my stomach, mingled with that undeniable curiosity. What could Jane's old college friend possibly want to write to me about after 3 decades? The silence of the house seemed to amplify the soft rustle of the envelope in my hands. The coffee maker clicked off. Outside, the threatened rain began to fall, soft drops pattering against the window pane, blurring the view of my backyard bird feeder. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth doing little to settle the fluttery feeling inside. It felt intimate. Somehow, this unexpected piece of the past arriving on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Part of me wanted to put it aside, wait until later, maybe call Jane first. But another part, the part that had been feeling a bit restless lately, urged me to just open it. What could be the harm? It was just a letter. I picked up the sterling silver letter opener my late husband, Tom, had given me years ago, another relic of a different time. Its coolness felt familiar and grounding. With a steady hand, I slid the blade under the flap, the sound of tearing paper unnervingly loud in the quiet room. Inside, there was a single sheet of the same heavy, cream-colored paper, folded neatly in thirds. The blue ink flowed across the page in the same careful script. I unfolded it slowly, my heart doing a strange little jump. It wasn't a long letter, just a few paragraphs. I started to read. He began by reintroducing himself, reminding me briefly of how we knew each other through Jane, acknowledging how long it had been. He wrote that he'd recently come across an old photograph from one of those college summers, a candid shot taken at a barbecue at Jane's parents' lake house. He said I was in the background, laughing about something caught mid-gesture. He wrote that seeing the photo had brought back a flood of memories, not just of that day, but of that whole summer, the feeling of being young and on the cusp of everything. Then came the part that really stopped me. He wrote about a conversation he'd overheard me having that day. I'd been talking to Jane's younger brother. I think about wanting to travel, specifically about wanting to see the Northern Lights someday. I barely remembered saying it. It was just a youthful dream, uttered casually decades ago. But Mark remembered. He wrote that my description of how I imagined the lights dancing in the sky, the colors, the vastness of it, had stuck with him all these years. He said he'd never forgotten the passion in my voice when I talked about it. He went on to say that he'd finally made that trip himself a few years back up to Alaska and had seen the aurora borealis. He described it briefly, the silence, the cold, the incredible, humbling spectacle in the sky. And he said quite simply that when he saw it, he thought of me, the young woman at the barbecue with the faraway look in her eyes, dreaming of dancing lights. He ended the letter by saying he hoped life had been kind to me and that maybe, just maybe, I'd gotten to see the lights myself. He didn't ask for anything, didn't suggest getting back in touch necessarily, just signed it, warmly Mark Ashton. I read the letter again, then a third time. My coffee sat forgotten, growing cold. It wasn't a love letter, not an invitation, not a sales pitch. It was a connection, a thread reaching across 30 years, sparked by a forgotten photograph and a half-remembered conversation about the Northern Lights. It was incredibly personal, yet respectful, intimate, yet distant. He remembered something about me I'd almost forgotten myself. The passion in my voice. I tried to recall that younger version of Sarah. Life hadn't exactly unfolded the way she'd planned. There had been joy, yes, my wonderful marriage to Tom, my children, but also compromises, responsibilities, losses. The dreams of seeing the Northern Lights had faded, buried under mortgages, tuition fees, and the everyday demands of life. Tom hadn't been much of a traveler. And now I was here in this quiet house with a letter from a near stranger who remembered a dream I'd let go of. A wave of emotion washed over me. Nostalgia, a strange sort of validation, a poignant sadness for the time past. And underneath it all, a flicker of something else, warmth, that someone had carried that tiny fragment of me with them for so long. I looked out the window at the rain, thinking about the aurora he described. I pictured the colors, the silence, and I felt an unexpected kinship with this man, Mark Ashton, who lived across the country in Oregon. The letter felt like a small, perfect pebble dropped into the still pond of my life, sending ripples outwards. What do you do with something like that? Ignore it? File it away? Or do you write back? The question hung in the air, as quiet and potent as the letter itself. For the rest of the day, and the day after, Mark's letter occupied a corner of my mind. I'd be reading a book or pulling weeds in the garden between rain showers, and the thought of it would drift back in. The image of him standing under the Alaskan sky, thinking of a conversation from decades ago. It felt surreal. I did call Jane, ostensibly just to chat, but I steered the conversation towards her college days, casually asking whatever happened to some of her old friends. When I mentioned Mark Ashton, she paused. Mark? Wow, that's a name from the past. The quiet artist guy, right? Moved out west years ago. Oregon, I think. Why do you ask? I hesitated. Telling Jane felt complicated. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt intensely private, this strange little connection. So I hedged. Oh, no reason really. Just reminiscing, I guess. his name popped into my head. Jane didn't push it, launching into a story about another college friend instead. After I hung up, I felt a pang of guilt for not being entirely honest, but also a sense of protectiveness over the letter and the feeling it had stirred in me. It was mine, somehow. That evening, sitting in my favorite armchair with Rufus asleep at my feet, I pulled the letter out again. I smoothed the creases, tracing his signature. What harm could there be in replying? Just a simple acknowledgement, a thank you for sharing the memory. It wasn't like I was looking for anything. Tom had been gone 5 years now, and while the sharp edges of grief had softened, I hadn't felt any inclination to date or seek out new romantic entanglements. This felt different. It wasn't about romance, it was about resonance, about being seen, even across a gulf of time and distance. So I took out my own stationery, not as fancy as his, but a nice pale blue set I kept for thank you notes. Finding the right words took time. I didn't want to sound overly eager nor dismissive. I started by thanking him for his thoughtful letter, saying how unexpected and touching it was. I admitted I barely remembered the specific conversation about the Northern Lights, but the memory of those lake house summers was vivid. I told him a little about my life, keeping it brief, mentioning my children were grown, that I was living in the same town, that I'd lost my husband. I felt it was important to be honest about that. I added that no, I hadn't made it to see the aurora myself, but his description sounded incredible, and it was kind of him to think of me. I kept it simple, friendly, matching his tone. I didn't suggest keeping in touch, just wished him well. Before I could second guess myself, I addressed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and walked out to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, dropping it inside with a decisive clink. As I walked back to the house, the evening air cool and damp after the rain, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the simple act of connection, of responding to an unexpected ripple. Whatever happened next, if anything, felt secondary to that. A week passed, then 10 days. I found myself checking the mail with a little more anticipation than usual, chastising myself for being silly. He probably wouldn't write back. Why should he? His letter had served its purpose, sharing a memory. My reply was just polite closure. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythm. Rufus needed his walks. The garden needed tending. My book club was meeting on Thursday. Yet the thought of Mark Ashton lingered, a quiet background note. Then, another cream-colored envelope appeared. This time, I recognized the handwriting immediately. My breath caught slightly as I carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen table while I made myself a cup of tea, deliberately slowing myself down. This time, his letter was a bit longer. He responded warmly to mine, expressing condolences for my husband's passing, sharing briefly that he'd also been through a divorce years ago, which was part of why he'd moved to Oregon for a fresh start. He wrote about his work. He was a landscape photographer, which somehow made perfect sense. He talked about the beauty of the Pacific Northwest, the forests, the coastline. He asked about my children, what they were doing. He also picked up on my mention of the lake house summers and shared another specific memory. A time a few of us, including him and me, had taken a canoe out on the lake late one afternoon and gotten caught in a sudden downpour, laughing as we paddled back soaked to the skin. I remembered that day, vaguely, but his description brought it back into focus. The warm rain, the smell of the water, the shared, silly adventure. He asked if I still enjoyed being near the water. It was uncanny how he seemed to remember these small details that resonated. We started writing back and forth regularly after that. Not every day, but maybe once a week. An envelope would arrive from Oregon, and I'd send one back from Pennsylvania. Our letters grew longer, more open. We talked about books we were reading, frustrations with technology, the changing seasons, the joys and challenges of navigating life past 50. We shared stories of our families, our pasts, our quiet hopes for the future. It was a conversation unfolding slowly, thoughtfully, on paper. There was a refreshing lack of pressure, of expectation. He sent me a photograph he'd taken, a stunning shot of Haystack Rock on the Oregon coast shrouded in mist. I sent him a picture of the first crocuses pushing through the soil in my garden. We learned about each other's lives, not through curated online profiles, but through carefully chosen words, shared vulnerabilities, and the simple act of taking the time to write to really communicate. We discovered a shared sense of humor, a similar outlook on many things, a mutual respect that deepened with each letter. The subtle tension I'd felt initially had dissolved, replaced by a comfortable, engaging intimacy. It wasn't romantic, not in the way people usually mean. It was deeper than that. Somehow, a meeting of minds, a companionship forged through ink and paper across miles and years. One afternoon, reading his latest letter describing a hike he'd taken in the Columbia River Gorge, a thought occurred to me, bold and clear. I wanted to hear his voice. The idea of transitioning from letters to a phone call felt like a big step, almost risky, potentially changing the unique dynamic we built. But the curiosity, the desire to add another dimension to this surprising connection was undeniable. I finished my tea, the cream-colored envelope resting on the table beside me, a tangible link to this person who had unexpectedly walked back into my life, or rather, written himself into it, enriching it in ways I could never have predicted when I first saw that handwritten address weeks ago. The question now wasn't just whether I'd see the Northern Lights someday, but whether I was brave enough to pick up the phone. It took me another week to work up the nerve. It felt strangely old-fashioned, arranging a phone call. In his next letter, tucked in after a paragraph about trying to photograph hummingbirds, I added a postscript. It's been so nice exchanging letters. I wrote, my pen hovering for a second. I find myself wondering what your voice sounds like after all these years. If you're ever inclined, perhaps we could chat on the phone sometime? I included my number and tried not to overthink it as I mailed the letter. His reply came a few days later, quicker than usual, arriving not in an envelope but as an email. He'd found my email address from an old alumni list Jane had circulated years ago. The subject line simply read, "Yes." Inside, he said he'd love to talk and suggested a time the following Saturday, accounting for the time difference. Just like that, my stomach did a nervous flip. Saturday seemed suddenly very close. What would we talk about? Would it be awkward? Would the easy intimacy of our letters vanish in real-time conversation? Saturday arrived, sunny and bright. I spent the morning gardening, trying to distract myself, but my gaze kept drifting to the clock. At the appointed time, I sat in my armchair, the phone feeling unnaturally heavy in my hand. It rang precisely on schedule. I took a breath and answered, "Hello, Sarah? It's Mark Ashton." His voice. It wasn't what I expected, somehow deeper, warmer, with a slight hesitancy that mirrored my own nervousness. But after the initial few awkward seconds of, "Can you hear me okay?" and "Thanks for calling," the conversation began to flow surprisingly easily. It felt like picking up a thread we'd already woven through our letters. We talked for over an hour. We laughed about the canoe incident he'd remembered, filled in more gaps about the intervening years, discussed the photos we'd exchanged. Hearing his voice add inflection and warmth to the words I'd only read before was lovely. It made the connection feel more real, more present. There were comfortable silences, too, moments where we both just seemed to be processing this transition from paper to voice. He asked more about Tom, listening with quiet empathy as I shared a little about our life together, and the void his passing had left. I asked about his photography, and he spoke passionately about capturing light and landscapes, about the patience it required. There was no pretense, no pressure, just two people talking, sharing their lives from across the country. As we were winding down the call, he said something that stayed with me. You know, Sarah, getting that old photo out and writing to you, it was an impulse, but one of the best impulses I've had in a long time. It's been unexpectedly wonderful, reconnecting like this. I felt a warmth spread through me. Me too, Mark, I replied, and I meant it wholeheartedly. Truly. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a while, the afternoon sun streaming through the window. The house didn't feel quite so big or so quiet anymore. This connection, born from a forgotten memory and a handwritten letter, had blossomed into something quietly profound. It wasn't about filling a void left by Tom or about seeking romance. It was about finding a kindred spirit at a time I least expected it, a reminder that meaningful connections can appear in the most surprising ways at any stage of life. It was about mutual respect, shared history filtered through time, and the simple, powerful act of being seen and heard. The unbelievable part wasn't some dramatic twist. It was the quiet miracle of this unfolding friendship itself. It had gently nudged me out of my comfortable, predictable rhythm, reminding me of the young woman who dreamed of northern lights, but also grounding me in the quiet contentment of the present. I didn't know where this connection with Mark would lead, whether we'd ever meet in person, or if we'd just continue to share our lives through letters and occasional calls. And strangely, that uncertainty didn't bother me. The journey itself, the rediscovery, and the sharing was the gift. Looking out at my garden, bathed in the late afternoon light, I felt a sense of quiet gratitude, a gentle expansion in my own heart. The pebble dropped in the pond hadn't just created ripples. It felt like it had let in the light.